The Grand Chamber of the Galactic Council stretched endlessly above Ambassador HFY of the Viridian Collective, its crystalline dome capturing and refracting the light of distant stars into dancing patterns across marble floors that had witnessed 1,000 years of interstellar diplomacy. Today, however, those ancient walls would bear witness to something unprecedented. The human delegation sat in their designated section, a modest cluster of beings that most council members barely acknowledged. Their representative, Ambassador Sarah Chun, maintained her characteristic composure despite the heated debate raging around her. The humans had requested this emergency session 3 standard cycles ago, and now the entire council was present to hear what many considered would be another tedious human complaint about trade regulations or territorial disputes. Council Speaker Vorthak, whose reptilian features bore the wisdom of 5 centuries, called for order with a resonant boom that silenced the chattering delegates. The floor recognizes the human delegation. Ambassador Chun, you have requested this emergency assembly. State your purpose. Sarah Chun rose gracefully, her dark hair catching the refracted starlight. She was smaller than most beings present, yet something in her bearing commanded attention. Honored council members, species of the galaxy, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber's acoustics. Humanity comes before you today not to request, not to petition, not to argue for our rights or territories. The chamber grew quiet, sensing something different in her tone. We come to inform you of our decision. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. Effective immediately, humanity is withdrawing from the Galactic Council and all associated treaties, trade agreements, and diplomatic relations. The silence that followed was deafening. Then chaos erupted. Impossible, roared Gordhak Prime, the Brittarian trade minister. You cannot simply leave. The mining contracts alone. Order. Vorthak's voice boomed again, but delegates were already on their feet, voices raised in protests, and questions that overlapped into an incomprehensible din. Ambassador Chin remained standing, waiting. She had expected this reaction. Gradually, the noise subsided as curiosity overcame outrage. The beings of the council wanted to hear what humanity thought it could possibly accomplish with such a dramatic gesture. You may think you can pressure us with this theatrical display, said Counselor Thex of the Aquarian Systems, her voice dripping with disdain. But humanity needs this council far more than we need you. Your primitive technologies, your single world. What do you think you will achieve in isolation? Sarah smiled, but it wasn't the diplomatic smile the council had grown accustomed to. This smile held secrets. Counselor Thex raises an interesting point about our technologies, Sarah replied calmly. She's quite right that we've always appeared technologically inferior to most council members. We've been the junior species, the newcomers grateful for scraps of advanced knowledge and minor trading rights. She moved to the center of the chamber's speaking platform, her voice now carrying to every corner. But I wonder if any of you have ever asked yourselves a simple question. How did humanity discover faster-than-light travel? The question hung in the air. Several council members shifted uncomfortably. The truth was, most had assumed humans had stumbled upon the technology or perhaps stolen it. The historical records show that humanity achieved FTL capability approximately 150 Earth years ago, continued Ambassador Chun. We appeared in your space lanes seemingly overnight, with ships that, while crude by your standards, were nonetheless capable of interstellar travel. Most of you assumed we had reverse-engineered, crashed alien vessels or had been given the technology by some benevolent species. Murmurs began to ripple through the assembly. The reality is far more interesting. Humanity developed FTL travel independently, through a completely different theoretical framework than the one used by every other known species in the galaxy. Zexhai felt his secondary heart skip a beat. As a member of the Viridian Science Cast, he understood the implications of what she was suggesting. while your civilizations perfected the art of manipulating space-time through exotic matter and gravitational field generators, Sarah continued, humanity approached the problem from the perspective of quantum mechanics and dimensional folding. We didn't learn to bend space. We learned to step outside of it entirely. The chamber had grown so quiet that the ambient hum of the station's life support systems became audible. For 150 years, humanity has maintained this fiction. We've allowed you to believe we were the lucky primitives, the late arrivals who stumbled into galactic society. We've accepted your condescension, your generous trade agreements that heavily favored your species, your treatment of Earth as a backwater world suitable only for agriculture and basic manufacturing. Council Speaker Vorthak leaned forward, his ancient eyes narrowing. What are you suggesting, Ambassador Chun? I'm suggesting that humanity has been conducting an experiment. For 150 years, we've been studying galactic civilization from within, learning your languages, your cultures, your technologies, your political systems, and most importantly, your weaknesses. The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop several degrees. During this time, humanity has not been idle. While we've maintained our primitive colonies and struggling industrial bases under your watchful eyes, we've also been developing technologies that none of you have even imagined. We've built infrastructure that exists in dimensional spaces adjacent to normal space-time. We've created manufacturing capabilities that operate on principles entirely foreign to your scientific understanding. Ambassador Chen activated a small device at her wrist, and suddenly, the air above the speaking platform shimmered with a three-dimensional projection of the galaxy. But this wasn't any star chart the Council had ever seen. This is humanity's true map of the galaxy, she said simply. The projection showed not just star systems, but networks of connections that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Pulsing nodes of activity appeared in locations that the Council's own maps showed as empty space. Vast structures spanned impossible distances, and energy flows moved through pathways that defied conventional physics. What you're looking at is the infrastructure of a Type 2 civilization operating in parallel dimension space. Every primitive human colony you've cataloged is actually an access point to our true industrial base. Every struggling human trade vessel that has visited your worlds has been conducting detailed scans and analysis that we've been feeding into our strategic planning systems. The implications began to sink in, and several delegates started speaking at once. But Ambassador Chun raised her hand, and something in her gesture commanded silence. This brings us to the present moment. 3 standard cycles ago, our analysis reached a conclusion that the human government found concerning. She paused, and the projection above her head shifted to show detailed statistics and probability matrices. Our models predict that the current galactic political system will collapse within the next 50 standard years. The resource conflicts brewing between the Kytherian Empire and the Andorian Federation will escalate into open warfare. The Zignari swarm is already showing signs of the territorial expansion patterns that preceded their last great conquest cycle. The economic imbalances created by the monopolistic trade practices of the core worlds are destabilizing the outer rim territories. The projection zoomed in to show conflict probability indicators spreading across the galaxy like a plague. Most critically, our analysis shows that in 73% of probable future scenarios, the galactic conflict resolution mechanisms, including this very council, will not only fail to prevent the coming wars, but will actually accelerate them through misguided interventions and favoritism toward politically powerful species. Counselor Thex stood abruptly. This is preposterous. You're making wild predictions based on 150 years of continuous data collection and analysis using computational systems that operate in 11 dimensions simultaneously, Sarah interrupted smoothly. Our predictive accuracy rate for galactic political events over the past 30 years has been 94.7%. The chamber fell silent again. Humanity has therefore made a decision. We will not be participants in the coming galactic collapse. We are withdrawing from all councils, all treaties, all trade agreements, and all diplomatic relations. Effective immediately, all human colonies, installations, and vessels are being relocated to dimensional spaces inaccessible to current galactic technology. She gestured, and the projection changed again, showing human installations simply disappearing. Star systems that had hosted human colonies showed those colonies fading away like mirages. As I speak these words, the evacuation is already 97% complete. Within 6 standard hours, there will be no trace of human presence in normal space anywhere in the galaxy. Ambassador Chan began walking toward the chamber's exit, her small entourage of human diplomats falling in behind her. "But you can't simply leave," called Gorthak Prime, his voice tinged with something approaching panic. "The trade agreements, the resource contracts, the technology exchanges." Sarah paused at the threshold of the great doors. "Counselor Gorthak, humanity has been honoring trade agreements that were deliberately structured to exploit our supposed primitive nature for over a century. We've been providing you with raw materials at prices that were set assuming we couldn't extract or process them efficiently. We've been purchasing your advanced technologies at premium prices while already possessing superior alternatives." She turned to face the assembly one final time. "For example, the quantum processing cores that you sell to us for 12,000 galactic credits each? We've been manufacturing superior versions for approximately 8 credits each for the past 70 years. We bought yours only to maintain the illusion of our technological dependence." The economic implications hit several delegates like physical blows. The Brittarian Consortium alone had made trillions of credits selling technology to humanity over the decades. The mining rights you granted us on the Outer Rim worlds were seen as generous charity to the poor humans. In reality, those worlds sit on dimensional fault lines that have allowed us to extract exotic matter from parallel universes at rates that would be impossible using conventional mining techniques. A single facility that you believe extracts a few tons of rare metals per year has actually been harvesting millions of tons from dimensional space. Speaker Vorthak's voice was barely above a whisper. "What do you want from us?" Ambassador Chen's expression softened slightly, showing something that might have been genuine regret. "Nothing, honored speaker. This is not a negotiation. This is not a threat. This is simply information. Humanity is leaving. We wish you no harm, but we will no longer be part of this galactic community." She activated her wrist device again, and suddenly her form began to shimmer slightly, as if she were becoming translucent. "We are already departing. What you see now are quantum echoes of our delegation, maintained only long enough to deliver this message. The real Ambassador Chun and her staff left normal space approximately 1 hour ago." The shimmering intensified. "We leave you with this final gift: our complete analysis of the coming galactic crisis, along with detailed recommendations for avoiding the worst outcomes. Whether you choose to heed these warnings is, of course, entirely up to you." A data crystal materialized on the speaking platform, pulsing with an inner light. "Farewell, galactic community. Perhaps in a few centuries, when you've matured sufficiently, our paths will cross again." The quantum echoes of the human delegation faded like morning mist, leaving behind only silence and the softly glowing data crystal. For long minutes, no one in the chamber moved or spoke. Then, slowly, the reality of what had just occurred began to sink in. Humanity, the species they had patronized, exploited, and dismissed for over a century, had just revealed themselves to be so far beyond galactic civilization's technological capabilities that they could evacuate their entire species from normal space in a matter of hours. More terrifyingly, they had done so not out of malice or conquest, but out of a simple, calculated decision that the rest of the galaxy wasn't worth their continued association. The silence stretched on, broken only by the soft hum of life support systems and the occasional shuffle of movement as delegates struggled to process what they had witnessed. Finally, Zexhai of the Viridian Collective rose from his seat. As a scientist, he was perhaps better equipped than most to understand the staggering implications of humanity's revelations. "Speaker Vorthak," he said, his voice steady despite his inner turmoil, "I move that we immediately convene an emergency scientific committee to analyze the data crystal left by the humans." Several other delegates nodded agreement, but Speaker Vorthak remained motionless, his ancient eyes fixed on the spot where Ambassador Chun had stood. "Speaker, Zethai Pompet Gen Li." Vorthak's voice, when it came, was barely audible. "In 5 centuries of service to this council, I have never seen anything like what just occurred. A species is just left. Not conquered, not destroyed, not absorbed. They simply decided we weren't worth their time and left." He gestured toward the empty space where the human delegation had been. "Do you understand what this means? They could have conquered us all. With the technology they've described, they could have enslaved every world in the galaxy. Instead, they studied us, found us wanting, and simply departed." The weight of this realization settled over the chamber like a suffocating blanket. Counselor Thex, who had been so dismissive earlier, now sat in stunned silence, her aquatic features pale with shock. The economic ramifications alone were staggering. If humanity had been deceiving them about their technological capabilities for over a century, how many other assumptions about galactic trade and politics were equally false? Gordhak Prime was frantically manipulating a holographic display, trying to contact Brittarian trading posts throughout the galaxy. From his increasingly frantic gestures, it was becoming clear that human colonies and installations were indeed vanishing from sensors throughout Brittarian space. "The mining stations on Kepler 442b are gone," he announced, his voice hollow. "Just gone. No debris, no energy signatures, no trace they were ever there. It's as if they never existed." Similar reports began filtering in from delegates throughout the chamber as they contacted their respective territories. Human presence was simply evaporating from the galaxy with an efficiency that defied comprehension. But perhaps most unsettling of all was the data crystal that sat on the speaking platform, pulsing with its gentle inner light. Whatever information humanity had left them would likely contain insights into their own civilizations that they had never suspected anyone possessed. The thought that humans had been studying them, all of them, for 150 years was deeply disturbing. What had they learned? What patterns had they observed? What weaknesses had they cataloged? And, most frightening of all, what had they seen coming that was so terrible that they chose to abandon the entire galaxy rather than try to prevent it? Zexhai approached the speaking platform slowly, his scientific curiosity warring with a deep sense of foreboding. The data crystal seemed to pulse brighter as he drew near, as if sensing his presence. "Honored delegates," he called out, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. "Before we examine what humanity has left us, we must ask ourselves a crucial question. Are we prepared to learn what they have discovered about us? Are we ready to see ourselves as they have seen us?" The silence that greeted his question was perhaps the most eloquent answer the council had ever given. As Zexhai reached toward the data crystal, his hand trembling slightly, he couldn't shake the feeling that the galaxy had just changed irrevocably. Humanity's departure wasn't just the end of their participation in galactic civilization. It was the beginning of something else entirely, something that the rest of the galaxy was apparently unprepared to face. The data crystal pulsed one final time as his fingers made contact, and suddenly Zexhai's mind was flooded with information. Not just data, but perspectives, analyses, and predictions that made his knees buckle with their implications. In that moment, he finally understood why humanity had chosen to leave. And he realized, with growing horror, that they had probably made the wisest decision in galactic history. The data crystal's contents flooded through Zexhai's consciousness like a torrent of ice water, each revelation more staggering than the last. Around him, the council chamber had erupted into chaos as delegates received reports from across the galaxy, confirming what they had refused to believe. Humanity was indeed vanishing without a trace. The crystal didn't just contain raw data. It held 150 years of human observation, analysis, and understanding of galactic civilization presented with surgical precision. Through humanity's eyes, Zexhai saw his own species, his own government, his own personal actions, and decisions laid bare with a clarity that was both illuminating and terrifying. The Viridian Collective, his proud civilization of scientists and philosophers, was revealed to be a society so obsessed with theoretical knowledge that they had become dangerously disconnected from practical reality. Humanity's analysis showed how Viridian's scientific breakthroughs had been carefully fed to them by human researchers operating under false identities, because pure Viridian research had become so abstract as to be essentially useless. But that was just the beginning. The crystal revealed that every major galactic civilization had been similarly infiltrated and studied. The proud Kytherian Empire, with their massive fleets and territorial ambitions, had no idea that humanity had been secretly documenting every aspect of their military capabilities for decades. Human observers, disguised as refugees or traders, had mapped every base, analyzed every weapon system, and identified every weakness in the Empire's defenses. The Andorian Federation's supposedly impregnable democratic institutions had been thoroughly penetrated by human social scientists who had identified the precise pressure points that would cause their government to collapse. The cultural fault lines, the economic vulnerabilities, the political corruption that had been carefully hidden from their own citizens. Humanity had cataloged it all. Most disturbing of all was the section dealing with the Zygnari swarm. The Zygnari were the galaxy's ultimate predators, a hive-minded species that had conquered vast swathes of space through pure military might. They had been quiet for nearly 2 centuries, leading most galactic civilizations to assume they had either died out or lost interest in expansion. Humanity's analysis revealed the truth. The Zygnari had been preparing. Their period of apparent inactivity had been spent developing new biotechnologies, breeding new warrior castes, and planning campaigns that would dwarf their previous conquests. The attack would come within the next 15 standard years, and when it did, no existing galactic military force would be able to stop them. The humans had discovered this through a combination of long-range dimensional scanning and actual infiltration of Zygnari space, a feat that should have been impossible given the swarm's well-known hostility to all other life forms. Zexhai stumbled backward from the data crystal, his mind reeling. Around him, other delegates were beginning to approach the platform, drawn by scientific curiosity and political necessity despite their obvious fear. Speaker Vorthak's voice cut through the chaos. "Scientist Zexhai, what have you learned? What has humanity left us?" Zexhai looked around the chamber at the assembled representatives of galactic civilization. These beings who had considered themselves the apex of intelligence and sophistication in the galaxy. These leaders who had patronized humanity for over a century. "They've left us the truth," he said quietly. "About all of us. About everything." Counselor Thex pushed forward, her earlier arrogance replaced by desperate curiosity. "What truth? What do the humans claim to know about galactic civilization?" Zexhai activated his personal holographic projector and began displaying some of the less devastating revelations from the crystal. They know that the Aquarian systems have been manipulating interstellar currency exchange rates for 40 years, creating artificial economic instability that has allowed you to purchase resource-rich worlds at a fraction of their true value. Thex's aquatic features flushed a deep blue, the Aquarian equivalent of a blush. That's impossible. Our financial operations are classified at the highest levels. They know that the Brittarian Consortium has been using slave labor from conquered primitive worlds to manufacture the goods they sell as ethically produced to the core worlds. Zexhai continued, his voice growing steadier as the initial shock wore off. Gordhak Prime's massive form went rigid. "Those are lies. Brittarian law strictly prohibits. They have 3-dimensional recordings of the facilities," Zexhai interrupted. "Detailed documentation of the entire operation, including financial records and shipping manifests. The chamber erupted in accusations and denials, but Zexhai pressed on, displaying more of humanity's findings. They know about the secret military alliance between the Kytherian Empire and the Tau Ceti Confederacy. They know about the Viridian Collective's illegal experiments in artificial consciousness. They know about the systematic genocide that the Deneb Republic has been conducting against non-sapient species in their territory. Each revelation hit like a physical blow. These weren't just state secrets. They were the kinds of carefully hidden truths that could destabilize the entire galactic political order if they became public knowledge. But humanity wasn't threatening to expose these secrets. They were simply leaving, taking their knowledge with them into whatever dimensional space they now inhabited. "There's more," Zexhai said, his voice now barely above a whisper. "Much more. They've documented corruption, conspiracy, and criminal activity at every level of galactic civilization. But that's not the worst part. He manipulated his projector to display humanity's predictive models. The worst part is what they've calculated will happen next. The projection showed the galaxy 50 years in the future, and the image was apocalyptic. War fronts stretched across hundreds of light years. Entire species had been extinguished. Civilizations that had stood for millennia lay in ruins. And at the center of it all, expanding outward like a cancer, was the unmistakable signature of Zignari occupation. According to their models, the coming conflicts will reduce galactic civilization to less than 20% of its current population within 75 years. Most surviving populations will exist as either Zignari slaves or primitive post-apocalyptic societies fighting over the remnants of their former glory. The silence that followed was absolute. Finally, Speaker Vorthak spoke, his ancient voice heavy with a weight that seemed to press down on the entire chamber. And they simply chose not to be part of it. "Yes," Zexhai replied. "Rather than try to prevent it, rather than warn us, rather than use their superior technology to save us, they simply left. They decided that galactic civilization is beyond salvation." The implications of this decision were staggering. It wasn't just that humanity possessed technology far beyond anything the galaxy had imagined. It was that they had used that technology to study their fellow galactic citizens for over a century, found them morally and politically inadequate, and chosen to abandon them to their fate. Delegate HXTAR of the Silicon Confederacy, whose crystalline form had been silently processing the information, suddenly activated his communication array. His harmonic voice resonated through the chamber. "I have just received confirmation from our deep space monitoring stations. Human installations throughout Silicon space have indeed vanished. But there's something else, something the humans didn't mention in their address." The chamber's attention focused on him immediately. "Our sensors detected massive energy signatures in the moments before the installations disappeared. The quantum patterns are consistent with dimensional translation, but the scale..." He paused, his crystalline matrix flickering with processing activity. "The scale suggests they didn't just move their colonies and ships. They moved entire planets." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. "Entire planets?" Speaker Vorthak repeated. "Earth itself is gone," HXTAR confirmed. "The Sol system now contains only 7 planets. The third planet, the human homeworld, has vanished completely. Not destroyed, not moved to another orbit, simply gone from normal space entirely." The technological implications were beyond staggering. Moving installations and ships was one thing, but translating an entire world into dimensional space required capabilities that the assembled civilizations couldn't even conceptualize, let alone replicate. Counselor Thex was staring at the data crystal with newfound respect and terror. If they can move entire worlds, why did they choose to leave instead of simply relocating us away from the coming conflicts? Zexhai consulted the crystal again, searching through the vast repository of information for humanity's reasoning. When he found it, the answer was both simple and devastating. because they don't consider us worth saving. He projected humanity's final assessment of galactic civilization onto the chamber's main display. The analysis was clinical in its precision and brutal in its honesty. Galactic civilization, according to humanity's extensive studies, had become evolutionary dead end. The various species had achieved technological advancement without corresponding moral or social development. They had created a political system that rewarded exploitation, encouraged corruption, and made meaningful cooperation nearly impossible. The humans had identified specific psychological and cultural patterns that repeated across every major galactic species: an inability to think beyond immediate self-interest, a tendency to create hierarchical systems that concentrated power among the least suitable individuals, and a fundamental lack of the long-term thinking necessary for true civilization. Most damning of all was their conclusion about the galactic response to crisis. According to human analysis, when faced with existential threats, galactic civilization invariably responded by becoming more divided, not less. Competition for resources would increase conflicts rather than encouraging cooperation. Fear would drive species toward isolationism and paranoia rather than unity. The Xignari attack, when it came, would not unite the galaxy against a common threat. Instead, it would cause every species to retreat into desperate self-preservation, making coordinated resistance impossible. "They're right," said a quiet voice from the back of the chamber. Everyone turned to see Delegate Kixera of the Centauri Trade Alliance, her insectoid features twisted with what might have been shame or despair. "Look at us right now," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "We've just learned that our most supposedly primitive members were actually our technological superiors for over a century. They've handed us detailed analysis of threats that could destroy us all. And what are we doing? We're panicking about trade agreements and worrying about how this affects our territorial claims." She gestured toward the data crystal. "They've given us the tools to potentially save ourselves, and our first instinct is to figure out how to use their revelations against our political rivals rather than address the real threats." The uncomfortable truth of her observation settled over the chamber like a suffocating blanket. Delegate Mordak of the Outer Rim territories stood up slowly. "The humans watched us for 150 years and concluded that we're not capable of the kind of cooperation that survival requires. Are they wrong?" The question hung in the air, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. Speaker Vorthak activated the chamber's emergency protocols, sealing the doors and activating privacy shields. "Before we continue this discussion, we must address a more immediate concern. If humanity's analysis is correct, we have perhaps 15 years before the Xignari attack begins. If we're to have any hope of survival, we need to begin preparations immediately." "Preparations for what?" demanded Gordhak Prime. "According to their data, we're doomed no matter what we do. They've apparently decided we're not worth helping. So what hope do we have?" Zexhai found himself studying the data crystal again, searching for any hint of hope in humanity's bleak assessment. And slowly, gradually, he began to find it. "They didn't just give us analysis of our problems," he said, his voice growing excited as the implications became clear. "They gave us their recommendations, specific steps that could be taken to avoid the worst outcomes." He projected a new section of the data onto the chamber's displays. "Look here, they've outlined a complete restructuring of galactic government, military organization, and economic systems. It's a roadmap for transformation that could actually work." The chamber stirred with renewed interest as delegates began examining humanity's recommendations. The proposals were radical. They involved abandoning much of the current political structure, implementing new forms of resource distribution, and creating joint military commands that transcended traditional species boundaries. But they were also practical and specific, with detailed implementation plans and contingency protocols for likely points of resistance. "This is essentially a manual for becoming the kind of civilization that humanity apparently considered worth their association," observed Counselor Thex. "Exactly," Zexhai agreed. They didn't abandon us because they wanted us to fail. They abandoned us because they calculated that we would fail to implement the changes necessary for survival. This is them giving us one final chance to prove them wrong. Speaker Vorthak studied the recommendations with growing amazement. These proposals, they're not just military preparations. They're social and political evolution. They're asking us to become something we've never been before. They're asking us to grow up, said Delegate Kixera quietly. The simple truth of that statement hung in the air as the assembled leaders of galactic civilization contemplated what it would mean to actually implement humanity's recommendations. It would require unprecedented cooperation between species that had been rivals for centuries. It would mean abandoning profitable but destructive practices. It would demand sacrifices of power and privilege from those who had benefited most from the current system. In short, it would require exactly the kind of mature, long-term thinking that humanity had concluded they were incapable of. But as reports continued to filter in confirming humanity's departure, the delegates were forced to confront a stark reality. They could either prove humanity wrong by rising to the challenge, or prove them right by failing to change and facing extinction at the hands of the Zignari. The choice was theirs, and time was running out. In the silence that followed this realization, each delegate was left to contemplate whether their species, and galactic civilization as a whole, was capable of the kind of transformation that survival would require. The humans had departed without a sound, but their absence was already reshaping the galaxy in ways that none of them could have imagined 6 months after humanity's departure. The galaxy was already fracturing exactly as their predictions had foretold. The emergency session that had followed Ambassador Chen's revelation had lasted for 17 straight days. For the first time in galactic history, the Council had actually achieved something approaching meaningful cooperation. Species that had been enemies for centuries had begun working together to analyze humanity's recommendations and develop implementation strategies. For a brief, shining moment, it had seemed as though galactic civilization might actually be capable of the transformation necessary for survival. That optimism had lasted exactly 43 days. The collapse began with the Rigel Trade Accords. The economic restructuring that humanity had recommended required all major trading partners to abandon the exploitative pricing mechanisms that had allowed the core worlds to maintain their economic dominance for centuries. The Aquarian systems have been the first to withdraw from the negotiations, citing unrealistic expectations and economic impossibility. Within a week, the cascade effect had begun. Species after species found reasons why humanity's recommendations were impractical, impossible, or unfair to their particular circumstances. The Kytherian Empire claimed that military integration would compromise their sovereign defense capabilities. The Brittarian Consortium argued that their economic restructuring would cause supply chain collapses that would harm the very species the reforms were meant to help. Each objection was reasonable on its surface. Each withdrawal from the reform process was justified by practical concerns and legitimate interests. But the cumulative effect was the disintegration of the most promising cooperative effort in galactic history. Now, as Zexhai sat in his laboratory on Viridian Prime, analyzing the latest intelligence reports, he could see humanity's predictions manifesting with terrifying precision. The galaxy wasn't collapsing because of external pressures or natural disasters. It was collapsing because its constituent species were simply incapable of acting in their own long-term interests when those interests conflicted with immediate gratification. A soft chime indicated an incoming priority communication. Zexhai activated his holographic receiver to see Speaker Vorthak's aged features materialize before him. Scientist Zexhai. The speaker's voice carried a weariness that seemed to have aged him decades in just 6 months. I trust you've seen the intelligence reports from the Zignari frontier. Zexhai noted Vili. The reconnaissance drones have detected massive military buildup in 17 different systems. Biofoundries operating at maximum capacity. New warrior caste breeding facilities coming online. They're not even trying to hide their preparations anymore. The timeline is accelerating, Vorthak said. Our xenobiologists estimate that the Zignari will be ready to begin their expansion within 10 years, not 15 as humanity predicted. The implication hung between them. If galactic civilization had been incapable of uniting when they had 15 years to prepare, they certainly wouldn't be able to do so with only 10. Speaker, I've been analyzing the failure patterns in our reform attempts, Zexhai said, calling up holographic displays showing the mathematical models he'd been developing. The humans didn't just predict that we would fail. They predicted exactly how we would fail. He highlighted specific data points in his analysis. Look at the Aquarian withdrawal from the trade accords. Humanity calculated that they would withdraw after exactly 40 to 50 days, citing economic concerns that were actually just protecting their illegal currency manipulation profits. They withdrew after 43 days. The Kytherian military integration resistance, Zexhai continued, predicted to begin after 60 days and focus on sovereignty concerns that were really about protecting their secret alliance with the Tau Ceti Confederacy. It happened after 58 days. Vorthak studied the projections with growing dismay. They knew exactly how we would react to their recommendations. More than that, Zexhai replied, bringing up another set of calculations. I think the recommendations themselves were a test. They weren't really expecting us to implement them. They were testing whether we were capable of the kind of cooperation that would make implementation possible. The holographic displays shifted to show probability matrices that were both elegant and damning. According to my analysis, humanity designed their recommendations with built-in failure points. Each proposal required the kind of long-term thinking and species cooperation that they had already determined we were incapable of. They weren't trying to save us. They were proving to themselves that we weren't worth saving. Speaker Vorthak was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. So when we failed to implement their suggestions, we proved their point, Zexhai finished. We demonstrated that their assessment was correct, that we really are incapable of the growth necessary for survival. And now, Zexhai manipulated his displays to show the current state of galactic affairs. The picture was bleak beyond description. Trade disputes were escalating into military conflicts. Ancient territorial claims were being pressed with new urgency as species recognized that resource wars were coming. The council itself was largely paralyzed as delegates spent more time protecting their own species' interests than addressing collective threats. Now we prove them right in the most final way possible, Zexhai said quietly. As if summoned by his words, another priority communication alert chimed. This one bore the emergency codes of the Galactic Defense Coordination Center. General Kextra of the Centauran Defense Forces materialized in the hologram, her normally composed features tight with stress. Speaker Vorthak, scientist Zexhai, we have a situation. Long-range sensors have detected a massive fleet movement from Zignari space. Zexhai felt his heart stop. The attack? Already? No, the general replied, which somehow made her next words even more ominous. It's not an attack fleet. It's a reconnaissance force, but it's larger than most species' entire military forces. They're conducting systematic surveys of defensive installations throughout the frontier sectors. She transmitted tactical data that filled their displays with the terrible reality of Zignari military capability. The reconnaissance fleet alone contained more firepower than the combined forces of 6 major galactic civilizations. How long do we have? Speaker Vorthak asked. Based on the survey patterns, our analysts estimate they'll be ready to begin military operations within 4 years, General Kextra replied. Maybe less. The communication ended, leaving Zexhai and Speaker Vorthak alone with the weight of impending extinction. For years, Vorthak mused, and we can't even agree on standardized communication protocols for military coordination, let alone mount a unified defense. Zexhai was studying the Zignari fleet data when something caught his attention. Speaker, look at this survey pattern. The reconnaissance fleet is avoiding certain sectors entirely. He highlighted the areas that the Zignari ships had deliberately circumvented. These are regions where human colonies used to be located. They're not scanning areas that humanity previously occupied. Because there's nothing there anymore, Vorthak pointed out. Exactly, Zexhai said, his scientific mind beginning to work through the implications. But why would the Zignari care about empty space? Unless he began running calculations, comparing the avoided sectors with humanity's old territorial claims and trade routes. Slowly, a pattern emerged that made him doubt his own sensors. Speaker, I'm detecting residual dimensional disturbances in the sectors the Zignari are avoiding. Very subtle, but consistent with the quantum signatures we observed during humanity's departure. Vorthak leaned forward. You think the humans left something behind? I think the humans are still watching, Zexhai replied, his voice filled with a mixture of hope and dread. He activated his most sensitive scanning equipment and began a detailed analysis of the dimensional anomalies. What he found confirmed his suspicions and raised terrifying new questions. There are observation posts, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Humanity is still monitoring galactic space. They're watching everything that's happening. But why? Vorthak demanded. If they've written us off, why continue to observe? Zexhai continued his scans, pushing his equipment to its limits. Gradually, more details became clear. It's not just observation posts. There are installations, large ones, and they're not just watching the galaxy, they're watching the Zignari. The implications were staggering. Humanity hadn't just abandoned the galaxy. They were actively monitoring the unfolding crisis from their dimensional refuge. They were tracking Zignari movements with the same precision they had once applied to studying galactic civilization. But they weren't intervening. They were simply watching. They're studying the Zignari the same way they studied us, Zexhai realized. This entire crisis, our failure to cooperate, the Zignari expansion, the coming collapse, it's all part of a larger experiment. An experiment in what? Species evolution. Civilization development. They're testing whether galactic civilization can evolve under pressure, whether the threat of extinction can force the kind of cooperation that prosperity couldn't achieve. Vorthak sank back in his chair, the weight of this revelation almost too much to bear. We're laboratory subjects. No, Zexhai corrected, his voice gaining strength as the full scope of humanity's plan became clear. We're students. This is our final exam. He pulled up humanity's original recommendations and began analyzing them with this new understanding. Look at their proposals again, but this time consider them as teaching tools rather than practical solutions. The mathematical elegance of humanity's plan revealed itself like a flower blooming in fast forward. Every recommendation, every timeline, every prediction had been crafted not just to address galactic civilization's problems, but to force a specific learning process. The trade reforms hadn't been designed to actually fix the galaxy's economic issues. They had been designed to make species confront the true costs of their exploitative practices. The military integration proposals hadn't been meant to create unified defense forces. They had been meant to force species to recognize that their survival depended on cooperation with their traditional enemies. Even the timing of the Zignari threat wasn't coincidental. Humanity had somehow known exactly when the swarm would emerge from their period of preparation, and had calibrated their own departure to create maximum pressure for galactic evolution. It's brilliant, Zexhai breathed. Ruthless but brilliant. They identified exactly what we needed to learn and created conditions that would force us to learn it. And if we fail, then we get exactly what their analysis predicted. Extinction, subjugation, or collapse into primitive barbarism. But now, with this new understanding, Zexhai could see possibilities that hadn't existed before. Speaker, what if we could convince the other species that this is what's really happening? That humanity is still watching, still testing us. You think that would change anything? I think it might be the only thing that could change anything, Zexhai replied. If galactic civilization understood that this crisis was designed to force our evolution, that humanity was watching to see if we could learn to cooperate under pressure, It could provide the external perspective necessary to overcome our internal divisions. Vorthak finished, his ancient mind grasping the implications immediately. For the first time in months, Zexhai felt something approaching hope. We need to call an emergency council session, not to discuss military preparations or trade agreements, but to confront the truth about what humanity really did when they left us. And what is that truth? Zexhai looked at his displays showing the hidden dimensional installations, the Zignari reconnaissance fleets, and the probability matrices that described galactic civilization's potential futures. They didn't abandon us, he said firmly. They gave us the greatest gift they could imagine, the opportunity to become worthy of their respect. The question that remained was whether galactic civilization could rise to meet that challenge, or whether humanity's faith in their potential for growth had been misplaced. Either way, they were about to find out. The emergency council session that Zexhai had requested took place exactly 1 year after humanity's departure, and the transformation in the Great Chamber was immediately apparent to anyone who had attended previous meetings. Where once delegates had arrived in ornate processions designed to display their species' wealth and power, they now came quietly, efficiently, with minimal ceremony. The galaxy had learned harsh lessons about the cost of political theater. Speaker Vorthak called the session to order with unprecedented brevity. Delegates, we face a simple choice: evolution or extinction. Scientist Zexhai has made discoveries that may fundamentally alter our understanding of humanity's departure and our current crisis. Zexhai rose from the Viridian delegation's seats, but instead of approaching the traditional speaking platform, he activated a holographic projector that filled the entire chamber with his data. Every delegate could examine the evidence directly, rather than simply listening to his interpretation. Fellow beings of the galaxy, he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast space. For the past year, we have operated under the assumption that humanity judged us unworthy of their association and abandoned us to face the Zignari threat alone. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembly. This assumption is incorrect, Zexhai continued, and the chamber fell silent. Humanity did not abandon us. They're still here, still watching, still hoping we will prove ourselves capable of growth. The holographic displays showed the dimensional installations that his team had discovered throughout former human space. The evidence was overwhelming: massive structures existing in parallel dimensional space, monitoring equipment that tracked every major galactic development, and analysis centers that continued to process information about both galactic civilization and the approaching Zignari threat. Delegate Mordak of the Outer Rim Territories was the first to speak. If they're still monitoring us, why haven't they made contact? Why maintain this charade of departure? Because contact would defeat the purpose, Zexhai replied, adjusting the display to show humanity's psychological and sociological models. Our species' development has been stunted by dependency on external authority. We've always looked to others, stronger species, established institutions, ancient traditions, to solve our problems for us. The display shifted to show comparative analyses of galactic civilization before and after humanity's departure. Look at what's happened in just 1 year without humanity as a safety net. Yes, we've had conflicts and failures. Yes, we've fallen back into old patterns of competition and mistrust. But we've also begun to address problems that we ignored for centuries when we assumed someone else would handle them. Counselor Thex leaned forward, her aquatic features reflecting the holographic light. Such as, the Rigel Sector resource crisis, Zexhai replied immediately. For 50 years, the Aquarian Systems and Brittarian Consortium fought over mining rights while the actual inhabitants of those worlds suffer shortages. Within 6 months of humanity's departure, you negotiated a sharing agreement that ended the conflict and provided resources to the people who actually needed them. Thex looked surprised. That was just practical necessity. The conflict was becoming too expensive to maintain. Exactly, Zexhai said, his voice gaining enthusiasm. Practical necessity forced you to find a solution that had always been possible, but never politically convenient. This is exactly the kind of growth that humanity was trying to encourage. He gestured to include the entire assembly. The Centauran-Kytherian military exercises that began last month. The joint research initiatives between the Silicon Confederacy and the Tau Ceti scientists. The emergency resource sharing protocols that 36 species have signed in the past 6 months. General Kextra stood up from the military observers section. Are you suggesting that our preparations for the Zignari threat are somehow part of humanity's plan? I'm suggesting that our preparations are exactly what humanity hoped would happen, Zexhai replied. They calculated that the pressure of an existential threat would either force us to evolve cooperative capabilities or destroy us. So far, we're evolving. The holographic display changed to show Zexhai's most recent discovery, one that had taken him months to verify and had kept him awake for countless nights wondering whether he should share it. 3 weeks ago, our deep space monitors detected something extraordinary. The Zignari reconnaissance fleet that's been surveying our defensive positions, it's being shadowed. The display showed sensor readings from the frontier sectors, enhanced and analyzed to reveal patterns that were almost invisible to conventional detection methods. Humanity is tracking the Zignari fleet using technology that our sensors can barely detect. They're monitoring every movement, every communication, every tactical decision the swarm makes. The implications struck the assembly like a physical blow. They're not just observing our response to the crisis, Delegate Kixera said, her insectoid features clicking with agitation. They're observing the crisis itself. More than that, Zexhai confirmed. I believe humanity is managing the crisis, not controlling it. The Zignari are acting according to their own nature and instincts, but humanity is ensuring that the test they've created for us is calibrated. Speaker Vorthack's ancient voice cut through the growing excitement. Explain. Zexhai took a deep breath. This was the part of his theory that even he found difficult to accept, despite the mathematical certainty of his calculations. The Zignari expansion isn't happening according to their optimal strategic timeline. Our analysis shows that they could have begun military operations 18 months ago with a significant tactical advantage. Instead, they've been conducting unnecessary reconnaissance, following attack patterns that give us maximum warning time, and avoiding targets that would cripple our response capability. The display showed detailed comparisons between optimal Zignari strategy and their actual observed behavior. It's as if they're being guided to attack us in a way that gives us the best possible chance to mount a coordinated defense. The silence that followed was profound. Finally, Gordhack Prime spoke, his massive voice carrying a note of wonder. Are you saying that humanity is somehow influencing Zignari behavior to ensure that we face a survivable but challenging threat? I'm saying that the probability of the Zignari naturally choosing tactics that give us optimal learning opportunities is approximately 1 in 4 million, Zexhai replied. Either we're incredibly lucky, or humanity has found a way to influence their strategic decisions without them realizing it. The chamber erupted in discussions as delegates began to grasp the full scope of what Zexhai was suggesting. Humanity hadn't just left them to face the Zignari threat. They had carefully orchestrated that threat to create the exact conditions necessary for galactic civilization's evolution. Delegate HX Tar of the Silicon Confederacy activated his harmonic voice projection, cutting through the noise with crystalline clarity. If this theory is correct, then our current military preparations, our diplomatic initiatives, our cooperative research projects, all of it is happening under humanity's observation and indirect guidance. Yes, Zexhai confirmed. We're not just facing a test, we're facing a custom-designed curriculum in species cooperation and long-term strategic thinking. And if we fail, ask Counselor Thex. Zexhai consulted his data one final time. If we fail, then humanity's assessment was correct, and galactic civilization doesn't deserve to survive. The Zignari will conquer us, just as predicted. And if we succeed, Zexhai paused, considering the implications of his own theory. If we succeed in mounting a coordinated defense against the Zignari, if we prove that we can cooperate across species lines when survival is at stake, if we demonstrate that we've learned the lessons humanity was trying to teach us, then what? Speaker Vorthak prompted. Then, I believe humanity will return. The words hung in the air like a promise and a challenge. Zexhai activated his final display, showing probability calculations that he had run and rerun countless times to ensure their accuracy. Humanity's dimensional installations aren't just monitoring posts. They're staging areas. The infrastructure exists to rapidly re-establish human presence in normal space if certain conditions are met. The display showed the hidden installations in all their magnificent scope. Not just observation posts, but manufacturing facilities, research centers, and what appear to be vast storage areas containing technologies and resources that defied classification. They're prepared to rejoin galactic civilization, but only if we prove that we've evolved beyond the limitations that made our association problematic for them. General Kextara studied the tactical implications with professional interest. What would constitute proof of our evolution? Successful defense against the Zignari through genuine cooperation rather than forced alliance. Zexhai replied immediately. Implementation of the social and economic reforms they recommended, not because they demanded it, but because we recognize the necessity ourselves. Evidence that we can think in terms of galactic welfare rather than individual species advantage. In other words, Speaker Vorthak said slowly, we must become the kind of civilization that humanity would want to associate with. Exactly. The chamber fell quiet as delegates contemplated the magnitude of what they were facing. It wasn't just a military threat that could destroy their worlds. It was a comprehensive examination of their worthiness to join the ranks of truly advanced civilizations. Humanity hadn't abandoned them in disgust. They had withdrawn in disappointment, but had left the door open for redemption. The question was whether galactic civilization could rise to meet that challenge. Delegate Mordak stood slowly, his voice carrying a determination that surprised even him. Then, we have our answer. We face the Zignari threat not as separate species fighting for individual survival, but as a united galactic civilization proving our worthiness to ourselves and to humanity. Murmurs of agreement began to ripple through the assembly. The military coordination protocols that General Kextara's teams have developed, continued Mordak, the resource-sharing agreements, the joint research initiatives, we implement all of them. Not because the crisis forces us to, but because they represent the kind of civilization we choose to become. One by one, delegates began to stand, each species representative adding their voice to what was becoming a declaration of intent rather than a mere survival strategy. We transformed the crisis humanity designed for us into the opportunity they intended it to be, declared Councillor Thex. We proved that galactic civilization can evolve, added General Kextara. We become worthy of humanity's return, concluded Speaker Vorthak. As Zexhai looked around the chamber at the assembled representatives, he realized that something fundamental had shifted. For the first time in galactic history, these beings weren't just thinking about their own species' survival. They were thinking about the kind of civilization they wanted to build together. It was exactly the kind of thinking that humanity had been hoping to see. The test was far from over. The Zignari threat was real and growing. The challenges of actual implementation would be enormous. But for the first time since humanity's departure, Zexhai felt genuine hope that galactic civilization might be capable of the growth necessary not just for survival, but for earning humanity's respect and eventual return. The final examination was about to begin 3 years after humanity's departure. The Battle of the Kepler Nexus would be remembered as the moment galactic civilization finally grew up. The Zignari swarm had emerged from their preparation phase with characteristic brutality, launching simultaneous attacks across 17 star systems, in what their war leaders called the softening. Their strategy was ancient and proven: strike terror into enemy populations, demonstrate overwhelming force, and watch as panicked civilizations either fled or fractured into desperate, uncoordinated resistance. For over 2 millennia, this approach had never failed them. Standing on the bridge of the Joint Command vessel Harmony's Edge, General Kextara watched the tactical displays with a mixture of professional appreciation and deep satisfaction. The Xignari were executing their attacks with typical efficiency, but something unprecedented was happening in response. Galactic civilization was not panicking. Instead of the expected chaos and fragmentation, the swarm's initial strikes had been met with coordinated resistance from integrated defense forces representing dozens of species. Kytherian battleships fought alongside Aquarian deep space platforms, while Silicon Confederacy computational arrays provided tactical analysis to Brittarian ground forces. Most remarkably, the Joint Command structure that had been theoretical just months before was functioning exactly as designed. General, called Commander Veltar from the communication station, we're receiving status reports from all 17 combat zones. The defense grid is holding. Kextara nodded, but her attention was focused on something else entirely. In the months leading up to the Xignari attack, her tactical teams had noticed subtle patterns in the swarm's reconnaissance activities. Their intelligence gathering had been thorough, but strangely educational. The Xignari had probed exactly the defensive positions that revealed weaknesses in coordination between different species' military doctrines. They had tested communications protocols in ways that identified integration problems between incompatible technologies. They had even conducted mock attacks that seemed designed to force joint training exercises rather than simply gather intelligence. It was as if the swarm was teaching galactic civilization how to defend itself. Now, as the real battle unfolded, Kextara could see the results of that inadvertent education. The coordination problems had been identified and solved. The technological incompatibilities had been addressed through desperate innovation. The joint training exercises had created operational capabilities that had never existed before. General, we're receiving a priority communication from scientist Zexhai, announced Commander Veltar. Zexhai's holographic form materialized on the bridge, but he was calling from an unexpected location, one of humanity's hidden dimensional monitoring stations. General Kextara, I hope you can forgive the unusual communication method, Zexhai began, his image flickering slightly due to the dimensional transmission interference. But I have information that you need to hear immediately. How did you access a human installation? Kextara asked, though her tone held more curiosity than accusation. 3 days ago, the dimensional barriers around this facility simply disappeared, Zexhai explained. Not damaged or breached, deliberately lowered. I believe humanity is inviting us to observe their monitoring operations. The implications were staggering. If humanity was allowing access to their hidden installations, it meant they believed galactic civilization had progressed to a point where such trust was justified. What have you discovered? Kextara asked. Zexhai's expression was a mixture of awe and vindication. Everything I theorized about humanity's involvement was correct, but the scope is far beyond what I imagined. General, the Xignari attack isn't just being monitored by humanity. It's being actively coordinated with them. The bridge crew turned to stare at the hologram. Coordinated how? The Xignari leadership doesn't know it, but their strategic planning is being influenced by carefully placed information that humanity has been feeding into their intelligence networks for months. Every tactical decision they've made has been guided to create optimal learning opportunities for our joint defense forces. Zexhai transmitted data that showed the elegant complexity of humanity's manipulation. Through a combination of dimensional technology, artificial intelligence systems that operated on principles beyond galactic understanding, and psychological insights gained from decades of studying Xignari behavior, humanity had essentially choreographed the entire conflict. The attacks are real, Zexhai emphasized. The Xignari are fighting to win, using their full capabilities. But The battles are happening at times in places that give us the maximum opportunity to demonstrate effective cooperation. General KXTRA studied the data with growing amazement. They've turned an invasion into a final examination. Exactly. And, General, we're passing. As if summoned by their conversation, the tactical displays suddenly showed new contact signatures throughout the battle zones. At first, KXTRA thought they might be Zignari reinforcements, but the energy patterns were completely unfamiliar. Then, the communications array activated, and a voice that the galaxy hadn't heard for 3 years filled the bridge of Harmony's edge. General KXTRA, this is Admiral Sarah Chun of the Human Dimensional Fleet. I believe you could use some assistance. The holographic display shimmered and resolved into the familiar figure of the former ambassador, though she was now wearing a military uniform that seemed to be constructed from materials that shifted between dimensions as she moved. Admiral Chun, KXTRA managed, her voice barely steady. I thought humanity had abandoned us. We never abandoned you, General. We were simply waiting for you to become ready for partnership rather than patronage. Around the battle zones, human vessels began translating into normal space with a grace and precision that made conventional FTL travel look primitive by comparison. But these weren't the crude ships that galactic civilization remembered from humanity's earlier presence. These were vessels that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, their hulls reflecting light that came from stars and other universes. The Zignari swarm represents a genuine threat to galactic stability. Admiral Chun continued as her ships moved to support the Joint Defense Forces. Left unchecked, they would indeed conquer most of inhabited space within a generation. But they also represent an opportunity, the chance for galactic civilization to prove that it can unite against existential threats. On the tactical displays, the effect of human intervention was immediate and dramatic. But rather than simply overwhelming the Zignari with superior technology, the human vessels were providing exactly the support necessary to allow the Joint Defense Forces to achieve victory through their own coordination and capability. You've engineered this entire situation, KXTRA realized. We provided the conditions for learning, Admiral Chun corrected gently. The learning itself, the cooperation, the innovation, the growth beyond petty species rivalry. That was all your achievement. The battle was turning decisively in favor of galactic civilization, but not because humanity was winning it for them. Instead, the human forces were enabling the joint defense fleets to fight more effectively than they had ever imagined possible. Advanced tactical analysis, dimensional communications that eliminated coordination delays, and defensive technologies that enhanced rather than replaced existing capabilities. It was partnership, not conquest. Admiral, what happens now? KXTRA asked as the Zignari forces began retreating from several battle zones. Now you finish what you started, Admiral Chun replied. The Zignari will retreat to their core territories and begin planning a larger campaign. You'll have approximately 2 years to prepare for their return. The question is whether galactic civilization will use that time to continue growing, or whether you'll fall back into old patterns of competition and mistrust. Through the dimensional link, ZXI was transmitting additional data from humanity's monitoring stations. The information showed probability matrices for galactic civilizations' continued development, and, for the first time, the projections showed genuine optimism. The economic reforms you've implemented to support the joint defense effort, Admiral Chun continued. The cultural exchange programs that have developed between species working together, the technological innovations that have emerged from combining different scientific traditions. These represent the kind of progress we had hoped to see. And if we continue that progress, Admiral Chun smiled, and it was the warm expression of a teacher proud of her students' achievements. If you continue that progress, then, in 2 years, when the Zignari return with their full invasion fleet, they'll face not a collection of frightened species fighting desperately for individual survival, but a unified galactic civilization capable of standing as equals alongside humanity. The implications of her words were breathtaking. Humanity wasn't just offering to help defend the galaxy. They were offering to welcome galactic civilization as peers in whatever larger community existed beyond the local stellar group. There are other galaxies, other civilizations, other challenges, and opportunities that dwarf anything you've encountered so far, Admiral Chen explained. Humanity has been part of that larger community for decades, but we've been waiting for our home galaxy to mature sufficiently to join us. General Kiextara looked around her bridge at the mixed crew of different species working together with an efficiency that would have been impossible just years before. She thought about the joint research projects, the integrated military commands, the economic cooperation agreements that had emerged from necessity but were growing into genuine partnerships. "We won't let you down," she said simply. "You already haven't," Admiral Chen replied. "The fact that you're fighting this battle together, that you've chosen cooperation over competition when your survival was at stake, that's all the proof we needed that galactic civilization was ready to evolve." As the Battle of the Kepler Nexus concluded with Zygnari forces in full retreat, Admiral Chen's final words carried across the communications networks of dozens of worlds. "Welcome back to the galaxy. Humanity is proud to call you partners." Over the following months, as humanity began re-establishing visible presence in normal space, the true scope of their absence became clear. They hadn't just been hiding in dimensional space. They had been exploring beyond the galaxy, making contact with civilizations that spanned multiple star clusters, and preparing for challenges that made the Zygnari swarm seem like a minor regional disturbance. But they had always intended to return, provided that their home galaxy could prove itself capable of growth. Zexhai, now serving as the head of the Joint Scientific Council that was studying human dimensional technology, often looked back on that day in the council chamber when Ambassador Chun had delivered humanity's farewell address. He had understood her words as a final judgment, a declaration that humanity was washing their hands of galactic civilization forever. Now he realized they had been something else entirely, a promise. A promise that humanity would return when the galaxy was ready for them. And finally, after 3 years of growth, struggle, and transformation, the galaxy was ready. The Zygnari would return. And when they did, they would face not the divided, squabbling collection of species they had expected to conquer, but a unified galactic civilization backed by humanity's dimensional technology and guided by lessons learned through the hardest possible education. It would be a very different kind of war than the Swarm was expecting. But more importantly, it would be fought by a very different kind of galactic civilization than had existed when humanity first departed without a sound, leaving behind only the hope that their absence would teach lessons that their presence never could. The galaxy had finally learned to deserve their return.